Greetings from White Oaks. Who wants to earn an extra 17 bips of return per year at the same risk level by only changing 5% of the allocation? I know I do. 17 basis points may not sound like a lot per year, but if you start with $1 million and invest back on 12/31/1979 all the way to the present, that's actually an extra $2.1 million. It's not so bad. Check out this video to find out how.
Greetings from White Oaks. In today's video, I want to talk about alternative investments and specifically how they make for great diversifiers. So if you consider only a portfolio with traditional asset classes, there are only two asset classes you're using, stocks and bonds. But within the world of alternatives, there are actually many asset classes. And many of these asset classes that are alternative investments are pretty uncorrelated with each other, as well as uncorrelated with stocks and bonds, and this makes for great diversifiers. And including many of these asset classes as well as stocks and bonds is a great way to achieve better risk-adjusted returns. This is a visual I pulled from a white paper I wrote a few years ago called The Magic of Diversification, and it shows you what diversification does to a portfolio. Diversification does not increase expected return by itself. Diversification does decrease volatility without compromising on expected return. If you want to then increase expected return, you can do what I call in this slide lever, or use leverage, which technically means to borrow money and invest more, but I'm really using that term very loosely here. And all I really mean is allocate more assets, more money to more volatile assets, thus getting higher expected returns with more of your assets in the portfolio. So here's an example of how this might work using some historical data. So I have annualized mean returns or average returns for stocks, bonds, and one alternative asset class called managed futures. And to be clear, there are many other alternative asset classes, but I'm just keeping things simple with one of them for the purposes of this example. So the annualized standard deviation is also shown on this chart, which is on the x-axis. And just as a reminder, standard deviation means how much a return typically deviates from the average in a given year. So the calculation is as follows. If you have an average return over a year for an asset class, some years you do better, some years you do worse. If you take each annual deviation from the average and square it, and then get the average squared deviation, then you take the square root of that, that's the standard deviation. So if we look at this example, you've got stocks with the most volatility and the highest return over this time period, 12/31/1979 to 5/31/2018. And then you have bonds being the most conservative asset class and having the lowest expected return. And managed futures, which is our alternative asset class, is somewhere in the middle. So let's start out with a portfolio that's just 50% stocks and 50% bonds. And let's add some managed futures. So we're going to diversify. We're going to take from stocks and from bonds a little bit to fund this 5% allocation to managed futures. And look what happens. The return stays the same, but the volatility goes down. So what's the next step? The next step is we will then take from bonds and add to stocks. So we all know stocks have more average return over time than bonds and more volatility. And so we're really just increasing the weighted average standard deviation of the portfolio by going from the red point to the green point. And that's how we're getting the higher return. But if you notice, from that first original blue point to the green point, we have actually increased our allocation to stocks and increased the allocation to managed futures, and we've decreased the allocation to bonds. So bonds were the least volatile asset class, and now we have less of them, and that's how we've gotten higher average returns. But we have the same level of volatility that we started with that 50 stock, 50 bond portfolio. So this shows you the actual numbers from those visuals. So you started out with that 9.61% average annual return for that 50 stock, 50 bond portfolio, and you had an 8.33 standard deviation. And I also put in parentheses what the 50% of the standard deviation for stocks and 50% of the standard deviation for bonds. If you add those together, it's 10.10%. So that's the weighted average standard deviation of that 50 stock, 50 bond portfolio. And you can notice that the 8.33 is obviously lower than that, and the reason for that is because there's some diversification benefit to having stocks and bonds. So the difference between that 10.10 and the 8.3 is what I'd call your diversification benefit for that first portfolio. So then if you go down to the next portfolio, expected return or average annual return over this time period, still 9.61, and your volatility is now lower by about 0.5% per year at 7.84, and you'll see that 10.07 is the weighted average standard deviation in the portfolio, which is about the same as with the first portfolio, but you just have more diversification benefit now because you've added a third asset class that's pretty uncorrelated with the first two. And you can see that bottom line there shows you the correlation between the 50 stock, 50 bond portfolio and managed futures. So it's close to zero. And then that final portfolio, you can see we've now increased the annualized mean return from 9.61 to 9.78, so 17 basis points of extra return per year, and your volatility is back to 8.33, which is where it started. And you'll notice that in parentheses, the 10.48 is the higher weighted average standard deviation that your new portfolio has versus the original portfolio, and that was the key to going from a 9.61% mean return to a 9.78% mean return. You allocated more to more volatile asset classes, and having more volatility in those asset classes gives them justification for more expected return. Now here's just a visual of the same thing. So if I look at the diagonal lines that are connecting that stock and bond asset class risk return profile, you can see where those meet to get you to the expected return and the weighted average standard deviation, and then the sideways line, or the horizontal line that goes from right to left, shows you the risk reduction through diversification benefit of that 50 stock, 50 bond portfolio. And now you'll see the same information with that second portfolio, where we're just connecting the three asset classes with the diagonal lines, and then you have the horizontal line that shows you the diversification benefit, which is now greater than the diversification benefit from that first 50 stock, 50 bond portfolio. And then finally you go through the same thing here with the third portfolio, diagonal lines connecting the three asset classes and showing you where your average return is and your weighted average volatility is, and then the horizontal line shows you the diversification benefit of that third portfolio. Thank you. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me.